Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Martin Hearn, Event Director here at Futurebuild, and it's fantastic to have so many of you joining us for today's session. Now, this webinar is part of our Connect 365 program, which brings the industry together all year round through curated content, community engagement, and critical conversations like this one. Today's topic goes right to the heart of what's shaping the built environment: credibility. Our latest research shows the sector is at a real sustainability tipping point where transparency, evidence, and trust in green claims are no longer optional. In fact, 86% of the built environment professionals now support mandatory life cycle assessments, and more than half of decision makers have switched or considered switching suppliers due to lack of transparency. These aren't just statistics, they're signals of a major shift in buyer behavior and expectations. But before we go further, I just want to take a moment to thank our partners who have played a vital role in making both this webinar and the research report possible. This initiative is proudly delivered in partnership with the Anti-Greenwash Charter, Hattrick, and the Carbon Literacy Project, three organisations at the forefront of responsible communication, climate education, and sustainability leadership in the built environment. Their insight, expertise, and collaboration has been instrumental in shaping the Green Claims Pulse Survey and bringing today's conversation to life. On behalf of the Futurebuild team, a sincere thank you to all three for your commitment to driving meaningful change in the industry. Now, in today's webinar, we're going to unpack the findings from the inaugural Green Claims Pulse Survey, drawing on insights from almost 300 professionals and nearly 3,000 consumers. You'll hear what these numbers really mean to you, whether you're in procurement, product innovation, marketing, sustainability, or leadership. Now, today I'll be joined by two brilliant guest speakers to help guide the discussion. First up will be Marlene Cunningham, founder and MD of Hattrick and a board trustee at the Carbon Literacy Trust. Now, she's a certified carbon literacy trainer and works with businesses to navigate the balance between commercial pressures and climate ambition. Also joining us will be Charlie Martin, co-founder of the Anti-Greenwash Charter and a director at Gusto. Charlie's a passionate advocate for responsible marketing in the built environment, helping sustainability-focused organisations strengthen their brand and credibility. Together, we'll explore how the industry can close its growing credibility gap, reduce risk in communications, and strengthen trust with clients, partners, and the next generation of talent. So from today, you'll get early exclusive access to our survey findings. You'll learn what's putting decision makers on high alert and take away practical steps to future-proof your green claims. So just a couple of quick notes before we begin. On the right-hand side, you'll find a chat bot. Please engage. These webinars are all about engagement. Really want you to get involved. So share your thoughts or introductions there. Also, please use the Q&A tab, the questions tab, for submitting your questions. We're going to have enough time to try and answer as many as possible. So please do get involved. These will happen after the main presentations. There's also going to be some live polls, and these will pop up throughout, and we'd love your input in those. It's also worth saying the full webinar recording will be available on demand afterwards. So check your inbox right after the session. And when we finish, you'll be auto-directed to a landing page with the full report available to download. We'd love you to share it with everyone in your organisation. So that's enough from me. It's now my absolute pleasure to welcome on stage Marlene Cunningham.
Hi, thank you, Martin.
Thank you. I'm going to leave you to it.
Great, thank you. Welcome, everybody, and good afternoon. So I've got the great pleasure of talking you through the results of the survey and the sort of highlights from the report. But as Martin said, obviously there's lots more to find in there, and you will have access to that after the talk today. So this presentation is a short presentation, just giving you sort of the highlights. I'm going to talk you through where the industry is at in terms of talking about your sustainability progress. And as Martin said, we're thinking of this as a sort of annual transparency check-in, and we'll be doing this every year going forward. So it's not just about telling you the numbers that that come out from the research, but also giving you some insights on the sort of the stories behind those numbers. And very briefly, just to tell you about the research that we carried out to get to these results. So we carried out an online survey of 280 industry professionals, so that's across the board in the built environment. And alongside that, we also ran, we took part in a UK consumer omnibus with just under 3,000 people. And through both of these, we looked at concerns around greenwashing and how willing businesses are to share the journey. We looked at the confidence that organizations and individuals have around talking about what they're doing, but also spotting greenwashing in particular from other organizations, and also sort of general behavior around these topics. And in terms of the consumer survey, we were asking people how confident they are that the built environment is able to build a green and more sustainable future for us all. So that's just to sort of set the framework for this conversation. And before we dive in, I just want to give a little bit of context, because obviously this piece of research has been done against a backdrop of what's happening in society in general. And it's fair to say that we're living in really disruptive times, and there is a general sense, I think, of distrust and scrutiny in society as a whole. And I don't know if you follow the Edelman Trust Barometer, but they produce this every year, and they look at sort of all sorts of aspects in terms of the general public and how they feel about business and people in power, governments, etc. And these are the figures from this year, where, and these are UK figures, I should say, where 64% of the general public believe that business leaders are purposely misleading them. And obviously, this is telling a real story around how we feel about organizations and how they're communicating. And obviously, this is even more pertinent, perhaps, in our sector, so the built environment, certainly against the backdrop of the likes of the Grenfell disaster, etc. And it means that businesses are operating in a landscape where they're under the microscope, and there are real concerns about, about businesses telling the truth, essentially. So what did we find then? Well, perhaps slightly unsurprising given that context, 66% in your industry are more concerned about greenwashing than they were a year ago. But interestingly, 63% are more confident in spotting greenwashing in the market. And I suppose to some extent those go hand in hand, because if we're more confident in spotting greenwashing at others, we might also feel more concerned about others spotting it in what we're doing. So they kind of balance each other. And over half of the respondents are also looking for more transparent evidence from suppliers in particular. In other words, we want more evidence to see that businesses are doing what they're saying that they're doing. And when it comes to the, sort of where organizations are seeing greenwashing, nearly half of the respondents were calling out their competitors, either in adverts or in case studies. And I suppose, again, it's not surprising perhaps, but I think it's quite telling. I think when we know if it's a competitor, we're in the same industry, we might be providing the same services and products, and we understand what it takes to be sustainable in that space. And we're looking at what they're doing and thinking, how are they achieving that? How is that possible? And that might be why we're questioning it. But all of this, obviously, then is also making us more concerned about both being called out ourselves, but also about whether other companies are telling the truth. And this is shown really clearly then in the research, where 38% of businesses have pulled back on communicating on what they're doing as an organization compared to a year ago. So really sort of strong trend here. We're not sure about quite maybe where we're at, and we're worried about people either calling us out or basically getting it wrong in general. And diving into those reasons in a bit more detail, when asked then, what is holding you back? Why are you feeling like you can't talk confidently about where you're at? 44% acknowledge that they perhaps don't have the knowledge internally. There are definitely training gaps within the organization, and they're looking for more of that to help them communicate more transparently and openly. And this really tallies with other pieces of research. We looked particularly then at marketing, for instance, where the Chartered Institute of Marketing, they did a similar survey looking at how confident marketeers feel about telling their organization's sustainability story. And over half of people in that survey said that they're really wary of telling sustainability stories because they're worried about getting it wrong and being called out for that, or even perhaps being caught by the generation, the legislation and the regulations that are in place. And then over half of people also talked about the fact that there are so many, there's so much confusing terminology in this space. There are very few clear definitions around what things mean. And it makes it really hard to, trust what people are saying, but also more difficult to actually call out what businesses are saying, because we're not quite sure of where we stand and, whether they're right or we're right. And it creates this, this general environment of uncertainty. And as Martin mentioned, as a result of this, there is a huge call for standardization across the industry. So our research was carried out at the same time, so back in April this year, at the same time as the Construction Product Reform Green Paper was live. So it's quite an interesting parallel. And we, as part of the research, we asked whether there should be a sort of a connection between sustainability, storytelling, or information about product information and that of safety, because that green paper was launched off the back of Grenfell, and 86% of people in our survey said that they were looking for standardized frameworks, a way of making sure that what business are saying is verified and true. And quite often, when we're talking about sustainability, we then talk about the next generation, and we're at quite an interesting time in business, in that as of, I think it's this year, the Generation Z is overtaking the Boomer generation for the first time. So there is a real sort of shift in business in general, and we know that the younger generation, you might be part of that group, obviously, on this call, are looking for more transparency, and they're looking for different things from businesses. And we believe that this is a real sort of unveil a real opportunity for organizations in this space as well, in that the consumer survey showed that as a group, this particular group is actually quite positive about the construction industry, with 65% believing that the sector is able to build a greener future. And in a sector where obviously there's a lot of talk about skills gaps. There's a lot of talk about, how do we bring fresh talent in, younger people with it, because there's an aging workforce in general. There's a huge opportunity here to actually demonstrate that this is an industry where people can go in and they can make a real difference. But part of that is obviously, sort of both telling a better story, but also obviously walking the talk and demonstrating that we're making progress in the way that we should be doing. So it's fair to say that sort of the crux of these findings is that businesses are shying away from talking about what they're doing in terms of making progress on their sustainability journey. But the interesting thing is, while that isn't happening, businesses are still taking action. So it's not that the action is falling away, it's just that we're not talking about it. And it's such a missed opportunity because, survey after survey shows that transparency is sort of a real magnet for both clients, talents, and investors. Because when we are open about what we're doing, and also open about the things that we're finding challenging, we're building trust, with these groups, these individuals, and these really key stakeholders. And I'm just going to show you a quick case study to sort of bring this point to life. And then we're going to do a quick poll and see what you think about that. So, Ace and Tate is a opticians. I don't know if you've seen them on the high street. But in short, they were on a journey to become a B Corp. And they got quite a few things wrong on the way. They had all the best intentions, and they were, changing things like they were looking to make the glasses frames, using better materials. But what happened was that they actually introduced additional materials, which meant that it was harder to separate the waste at the end of use, which meant that actually, rather than being better for the environment, they made it more difficult to be sustainable. And they made some other changes that meant that actually, rather than going forward, they were going backward. But instead of hiding, they went out with this campaign talking about the areas where they messed up, and not just sort of at the top level, but in real detail. So, they were breaking it down. These are just some of the sort of examples of the bad moves that they made. There's a lot more if you want to check them out online, in terms of sort of detailing out, what things that went wrong, and what they then did to address those. And I just think it's a really interesting example of how you can take a situation where things are not quite going your way, in quite a significant way, but turn that around into something that builds credibility again. And I'm really interested in understanding how you feel about that as a case study. So hopefully we'll just get a quick poll up now that you can fill in. Can we get that poll up? I can't see it, so I'm not sure if you can. But if not, we can perhaps go back to that later. But anyway, like I said, I'm interested in your thoughts on that, in terms of, what a difference it makes when somebody is really transparent about what's going right, but also about what's going wrong. So sort of wrapping up this and looking at then, what can we do as organizations to, move away from this place where we feel like we can't talk about it. Because as Martin said, as an industry, we're at this tipping point. And I guess the message that we're trying to take from this is, don't let silence cost you your credibility, because it will give you a real edge when it comes to, winning that trust back from, from your customers, from all your sort of key stakeholders in the industry. And sort of how can we do that then? Well, the key things is about helping your team and people within the businesses understand both the language in this space. What goals do you have as an organization, and that will help them communicate more with more clarity, but also enable people to ask better questions. Then builds sort of more credibility by obviously being more transparent, but also sort of enlist these third-party verifications and put some real sort of transparent reporting protocols in place. Investing in a green claims policy, so being clear and upfront about what you will say, what you will share, how you define those terms, and all the claims that you're making. What do they mean? What kind of what do those terms mean for your organizations, and how you're going to achieve those? But also, be more open to collaboration, working with clients and your supply chain, and making sure that you get feedback along the way. Because ultimately, we're all in the same boat, and it's about creating, an open and honest conversation. Because ultimately, this is really hard. Nobody's looking for perfection. We're looking for progress, and that's really key. And, as I said before, you will get a chance to download the report in a minute. There's obviously a lot more information in here at the end of today, but if you want to, you can do that now using that code. And then we're now going to have an open Q&A led by Martin. So I invite Martin and Charlie to join me on stage.
Thanks, Marlene. I think that was absolutely fascinating. Just for everyone watching, we want to take your questions. Please don't put them in the chat, but put them in the questions tab. There's some already coming through. Charlie, I thought actually, as you're joining us, and people don't know who you are, it'd be great if you could just give an intro to yourself, but also to the Anti-Greenwash Charter as well, that we at Future are really proud to have supported for a number of years.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Martin, for the introduction, and Marlon, thank you for running through the research so well just then. So yeah, guys, for those that don't know me, I'm Charlie. I'm the CEO and founder of the Anti-Greenwash Charter. As Martin alludes to, we've had an ongoing relationship with Futurebuild, I think since 2023, when we did our first piece of research together. And essentially, the Anti-Greenwash Charter was born out of a client brief to essentially run a campaign to essentially reassure stakeholders, both internally and externally, that this organization we were working with was a responsible communicator, and very much aligned with many of the points that Marlon just made when reflecting on what needs to be done to address this growing issue of greenhushing. So for anybody that wants to sort of find out more about exactly what our work entails, feel free to go to antigreenwashcharter.org to learn more.
Brilliant, thank you. And Charlie, first question's for you, actually. So the report shows that 2/3 of professionals are more worried about greenwashing than they were a year ago, and 38% have actually quite scarily dialed down their sustainability messaging altogether. So question is, what risks does this pose for organizations and for the wider industry's progress?
Martin, it's a great question. Let me try, and you've delivered it so concisely, let me try and give you my concise response to that. I think the first thing I want to pick up on with this actually is that obviously this is a pulse survey, and I'm fascinated to see where we're at in 12 months' time relating to these questions. I think in particular because it is a scary place out there in the world of sustainability communications. We've got various different are we, aren't we legislative issues arising. Lots of our guests that are on here today will be aware of what's going on in Europe with the Green Claims Directive, which is a signature piece of regulation that we're not quite sure what's happening with in terms of its implementation. Here in the UK, we've had the Digital Markets Act 2024 come into play early part of this year, which essentially has given the CMA some more stronger sort of penalization tools and levers, if you like, where they can actually now penalize us up to 10% of our global revenue in terms of fines if we're found to be greenwashing. So the first thing to say when looking at this stat of, I think the headline stat of 38% of organizations are dialing back, is that it's very understandable. It is it's a scary place out there in terms of, the implications of getting this stuff wrong. But I do think there are some fundamental risks if this trend continues and if we all essentially shut up shop when it comes to how we communicate our sustainability credentials. And I'll pick out kind of two, one from the organizational level and one from the industry level, just to address the question. I think first, from an organizational perspective, it was Marlin during talking through the research that kept referring to this notion of trust. Essentially, when we stop communicating our sustainability credentials, we create a vacuum of trust. We create essentially a quietness, if you like, around the way that our organizations are operating. And that does not aid a trusting relationship between the organization and its stakeholders, both internally and externally. So I think that's really the missed opportunity for an organization that is holding back on sustainability comms, is that you're just missing out on the opportunity to build trust with your stakeholders. And trust is such a important commodity, if you like, as organizations operating not only in the built environment sector, but really any organization operating in the 21st century in our kind of post fake news and corporate misinformation age. So that would be my first point on the major risk, I think, associated with from an organizational level. I think from an industry perspective, this is a slightly more sort of, I guess in a way, sort of moral impact-led point, if you like. And that is that we constantly talk about the need for collective participation and peer-to-peer learning in order to facilitate the kind of outcomes that we need to realize on a macro level. So, we need to be sharing best practice. We need to be sharing the impact of the work that we're doing and the investments that we're making in the sustainability of our organizations, because by doing that, we're able to collectively improve and learn together. So I think from an industry-wide perspective, the built environment is obviously one of the most significant sectors that we have at play, certainly here in the UK from an emissions perspective. We need organizations to be sharing, at least with one another, how they're going about approaching the sustainability of their offering. So those would be my two major risks, Martin, but we could go on. I could be here taking over the rest of the Q&A, giving you others, but those would be my two that I would highlight.
Brilliant. Thanks, Charlie. We've got loads of questions coming through. It says we've got plenty of time, by the way, so please keep the questions coming through. Malin, a question for you, and actually this might be a good opportunity as well to sort of introduce both Hattrick and the Carbon Literacy Project. But the report highlights that only 18% of professionals feel very confident spotting greenwashing, while 44% say that training gaps stop them from speaking up. How can organizations out there listening really address that skills gap within their own organizations in a meaningful way?
Yeah, great question. So I guess if I explain, part of what we do that will help with the question, I'll be very transparent then about, the answer I'm giving as well. So I run a PR and thought leadership agency that specializes in this sector. And as we all know, sustainability has always been a big topic. Part of the reason that you've been around and doing the great stuff that you're doing at Futurebuild for such a long time as well. And as part of that, we offer training, which is carbon literacy training, which is a fantastic. It's a framework essentially for helping people understand the fundamentals around, particularly the race to net zero. And it's been recognized by the UN, and clearly I'm going to say that that is a great starting point for organizations. It helps people understand the basics around the terminology and what's happening. And I think that is one of the things that putting people off. It's just so complex, isn't it, the way that it's talked about, and very few people understand the terms, unless you're, a real specialist. So it helps with that. But I think the biggest thing that the training like that does is, help you with confidence, but also, makes it helps you understand that it is complex and that nobody's got it sussed yet. Because I think that's one of the big issues, that we think that all of these people have got it sorted, when really that isn't the case. People are most people are still working out how we're going to do that. And once we understand that, then it's easier to start the journey and be more honest about what we're doing. So so I would say, obviously, carbon literacy is a great platform for understanding it. It's tailored for particular organizations or groups of people, so it's a great one for that. And then, depending obviously on the role you have within an organization, it then needs to be tailored. So like we offer greenwashing training, for instance, or how you use it in marketing. But each role within an organization will have different types of training, obviously, to help. But those are the two I can sort of point you towards.
Brilliant. Thank you. And actually, staying with you, storytelling is such a powerful tool in communications. So what advice would you give any organization listening that wants to move beyond that fear and start telling their sustainability story with integrity?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is go back to what we talk about a lot, and it's that thing about progress, not perfection. So because nobody has got this sussed out yet, it's about having the confidence in where you're at. In fact, one of the co-founders of the Carbon Literacy Project, he's got this amazing saying, which I just think works for this. It's like, start where you are, do what you can. And if you can internalize that, that really helps. So it's recognizing that to start with. And then I would just say there's sort of 3 key points. So, have some clarity, start with some clarity around what you need to do as an organization. Businesses, nobody can do everything. So you focus on the bit where you're going to make the most difference, and then understand what that looks like. And accept that some of that's probably going to be messy and confusing at times, but you've got a starting point. Then make those commitments and map out that journey so you know where you're at. And then the final point is obviously going to be about communicating transparently about where you're at then and how you're making progress. So, and one of those things would be, for instance, then to create this green claims policies that Charlie talked about before, to spell that out to your audience.
And sorry, Marlon, can I just jump in there just on that point? I think, and Marlon's just nailed that, I think, in terms of the sort of broad strategic approach that any organization should take to sustainability storytelling. I think the impact of proactive disclosure is absolutely fundamental here. Obviously, Marlon presented the Ace and Tate example in the research piece, and it was fascinating to see the polling statistics suggesting that I think the majority of people would dig a little deeper, having seen what they saw with Ace and Tate in terms of their presentation things, which is totally understandable. But I think what is also understandable in that is that there's a disarming nature to getting on the front foot and proactively disclosing in that way. You as an organization, if you're able to get ahead of it and ultimately, be upfront essentially about where you are at, there's a lot of forgiveness in that. There's a lot of acceptance that we are in this kind of, I love the term clumsy when it comes to where we're at in the sustainability journey, if you like, collectively. We're in a clumsy space. And as long as we can acknowledge that and be upfront and proactively disclose where we are, which is the power of a green claims policy in this context, I think that goes a long way. So sorry, Marlon, I probably just reiterated what you've just said in a roundabout way, but just wanted to jump in.
Yeah.
No, it's brilliant. And Charlie, I've got one more question for you before I go to the questions that have been submitted by the audience. But actually, before I do that, everyone, if you go into the links section, which is across the bottom, you'll find links to the Anti-Greenwash Charter, the Carbon Literacy Project, Hattrick, and the Reporting 4 as well. So you can click on that tab and find links to the various websites and reports. But Charlie, question for you. So the survey shows that 2/3 of UK consumers remain sceptical or unsure about the sector's green credentials. So what do we need to do as an industry to really rebuild that trust with the public?
It's a great question, Martin. So, and I think actually it just sort of piggybacks on my previous response. We need to collectively, I think, as an industry, come up with an accepted, agreed standards of communication. At the moment, we have this really weird mix in sustainability comms world. We've got this sort of regulation that's sort of having a bit of an impact, but perhaps isn't going the full way. We then have voluntary standards like the Anti-Greenwash Charter, and there are a number of others that are kind of pulling us, if you like, in terms of that carrot of best practice. But I still think it's fairly up in the air in terms of the standards that everybody accepts that we're going to communicate by. So what I'm fascinated to see over the next year before we do the next pulse survey is hopefully the kind of clarity around how the standards that we expect from organizations in the built environment sector will begin to sort of be set in stone. And once that happens, hopefully that creates the space and the confidence, if you like, within these organizations to then be able to start communicating their sustainability credentials. Because I think that's the key. When we look at the research, when we think about organizations that we work with, the number one thing that comes back is lack of confidence. So we need confidence both internally from a training perspective, and that's where the great work that Marlon and the Carbon Literacy Project are doing really comes in. But we also need some external clarity, I think, when it comes to regulation about exactly how we're expected to engage. So those are the two things that need to happen. And then within the industry itself, I think we need to collectively disclose and be comfortable disclosing the messy nature of where we are as organizations. And by doing that, we can then engage in a reasonable dialogue and engagement with one another. Those would be my reflections on that question.
Brilliant, thank you. We've had a fantastic question coming by Robert Pike. And Charlie, this might be a great opportunity to highlight some of the great work that your signatories of the Anti-Greenwash Charter do. The question is, who are your green shouting heroes leading the way to counter green hushing washing? What existing case studies should we look at as exemplars?
It's a great question. Was it Richard? Sorry.
Yeah, Robert.
Robert, great question. So I think this is an outrageous plug, but if you go to the Anti-Greenwash Charter website, antigreenwashcharter.org, you can actually go and there's a stories tab on there, and you can read all of the stories that we have, the case studies essentially written about our signatories. I think the most common kind of narrative that comes out of those stories, if you go and read those interviews, is really what I just described. This idea that these organizations knew that they wanted to build confidence, firstly, internally in the way that they went about communicating their sustainability credentials. We work with them on that through the training provided, through the content reviews and the creation of a green claims policy. But that by doing that, that's now given them the confidence to then go out externally and really present themselves to their industry, if you like, in terms of how sort of responsible they are communicating those credentials. So I think that's really the key narrative, if you like, dealing with lack of confidence internally, and then ultimately that leading to you confidently being able to disclose externally. Brilliant.
Thank you, Charlie. Malin, one for yourself, and this is from Aaron Lyons. And I think this is a very, very good point as well, because cost comes up a lot, especially when it comes to EPDs and LCAs. These are costly processes to go through. So he said, how would you recommend those within the construction supply chain to develop and release LCAs but cannot necessarily afford validated EPDs or validated LCAs?
So I think, I mean, it depends on which, why you, if it's just from a comms perspective, which is obviously where I would come from, then you it's the same thing. You have to be transparent about that. You try and do as much as you can do, and you're open and honest about where you're at. And I know that it just feels really uncomfortable, doesn't it? Because it's not what we're used to, how we're used to communicating in general. We're used to a world that's where you don't tell your competitors what you're doing, etc. But I think it's almost like a readjustment in terms of the mindset more than anything. If we think about some of this as more hygiene, it's more of a health and safety type conversation, and other things are more of a marketing storytelling thing. And I think this is where some businesses are getting it confused, that you have to think about what the story is you're trying to tell and why you're telling it. So yeah, some of it will be very hygiene type conversations, and other ones will be more hero type conversations where you're putting different levers and you're maybe telling more of an emotive story. I don't know if that answers the question.
And Charlie, do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, can I just jump in? I think it's a really interesting question. This again is a little bit of a plug for the power of green claims policy, but this actually has come up in one of our signatories, green claims policy. We have a section that is required, and it's actually the first section of every green claims policy, which is titled "Where We Can Improve." And the idea of this is not that it's appended to the bottom and it's that thing that you might never get to. It is literally that first page when you enter into a green claims policy. And this signatory that I mentioned have detailed exactly that longer term, their intention is to fully verify the EPDs, LCAs, and other verifications that they want to apply to their offering, but that they're not quite there yet. And the whole idea here is that you're turning, perhaps what is a weakness right now into an intention for improvement in the future. And I think, again, as long as you're upfront and clear, as Marlon said, about those limitations, I think that can go a long way to appeasing, certainly from a storytelling and a marketing comms perspective, anyone that's kind of dig a little deeper into your claims. So again, that's the power. I always say to organizations, almost regardless of whether or not you work with us at the Anti-Greenwash Charter on some of the other elements of our framework and the way that we support organizations, the power of a green claims policy is something that I think every organization should really be looking at adopting, because it is that getting ahead, being proactive, disarming nature of it. And I should just say that on our website, if anybody is interested, you can download our green claims policy template so that you can start flashing out your own. But yes, that just to add to Marlon's point, really.
Great. And this is a great question. It's coming from Sophie Lang. And actually, we held a live event, and this was discussed at the panel as well. But it talks about, what about the role of internal communications, especially linking those technical teams and the marketing and comm teams? How can they support each other and to create compelling and accurate storytelling? And I know this came up as well with the sort of, a lot of organizations now have heads of sustainability, and how are we linking them in with the comms team? Malin, one you want to take first of all?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would refer back to the training essentially. So I think the first thing to do is sort of get people more on the same page. So again, you have somebody in a sustainability role is obviously going to be, generally speaking, more technically minded and will be, completely immersed in all things sustainability and terminology. And it can be quite a bridge then to go and speak to somebody who's used to, selling a story in a different way. And it's there's a bit of overlap with what I talked about before, is like determining what stories you're telling and focusing on the things that you're really wanting to get across and need to get across. And then, so going back to the training side of things. So by having, something like carbon literacy, or, there are other frameworks out there as well that help people get on the same page and break some of those barriers down, that would really help get some foundation knowledge in place. And then, essentially recognize, I guess, your individual skills, your skill sets and how they are complementary. So obviously, the sustainability team will be able to scrutinize in a way and, I guess, verify that what the marketing team is putting together is, stands up to scrutiny. But equally the other way around, a lot of talk in the sustainability sector is about the fact that actually sustainability teams are not necessarily the best communicators. We're not, it's not the role that they're to fulfill. And I think it's important to recognize that marketing really does have a specialism here. And if they can have the confidence around some of the terminology, etc., they can tell much more powerful stories.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting, when we looked at the background in terms of, I referred to in the talk about, CIM was saying that marketeers are feeling really out of their depth here. And no wonder, there is so much at stake, isn't there, in terms of the both, being called out by the regulators, potentially being fined, etc. But, if we can, by working together, they can get the confidence to do both well.
Martin, can I just jump in here? Because I think it's a really, really, I think Marlin's nailed a lot of that, but I think it's a really interesting question from Sophie, I think it was. There is this real conflict at play, I think, in terms of wanting to create content, essentially advertising, marketing content that engages and impacts people emotionally and ultimately draws their attention, and that's one requirement. And then we've got this increasing requirement for that content to be sort of structured in a particular way, and essentially there's a creative conflict there, because you're essentially drawing some of that creative opportunity in what you're putting together away from the marketeer. But I think Marlin's absolutely right. The only way that we ultimately address this is we get the creative people, the marketeers in our organizations, the salespeople. I think that's something else to really flag here. I think in the previous piece of research that we did, a lot of greenwashing actually is experienced through a sales representative, through a salesperson. So what we need to do is educate those people so that what they do is they're able to utilize initial kind of terminology and campaigns and engagement that do, impact people emotionally and do draw their attention, but then be very, very wary, I think, of quickly establishing those kind of credible sources of evidence, of verified third parties, et cetera, et cetera. I think for me, it's all about tiers. It's all about making sure that if you're going to make big, bold, broad statements, then you have to very, very, very quickly present the detail, present the evidence that you have to back up those statements. It can't be burrowed away, if you like. So sorry, that was a bit of a sort of an all over the place response, but just something interesting.
No, and absolutely, we talk about the tiering a lot in our training, actually, because it really is a requirement of the legislation as well. You have to be able to provide, the information to back your claims up, essentially. But in reality, not everybody is going to be interested in that. That's why, you kind of, go back to this sort of hero hygiene, putting the stories into buckets and deciding, where they belong. But regardless of the story, you then still have to be able to have, that, the verification that is true, essentially, behind it. And that might sit somewhere else, so that people can find it and find it quite easily. And that would include things like, how, if you're talking about net zero, what do you actually mean by that? Because, as we know, these terms are thrown about, but people don't necessarily know what they mean. And even if I think I know what it means, it might be different from what you think it means. And it's just, establishing that, isn't it?
And Martin, sort of just to finish, I know, Martin, you're eager to throw another question here, but again, I'm just going to do a final plug here of the power of a green claims policy. Martin's absolutely right. If you've got, you've created a blog article, a website, case study, whatever, and it features terminology that might be misunderstood or misconceived, etc., or, claims that you want to, provide more detail for, the power of then hyperlinking to your green claims policy so that people can very quickly go and understand the nature of what you've actually said and understand the context of it. I think the other thing that we encourage all of our signatories to do, which again, I think is really important, and actually comes back to the core of what Marlin discussed in the research, is we encourage all our signatories to include declarations at the bottom of content, which basically says, look, if you're engaging with this content and there's something that you don't understand or something that you think is misrepresented, like, we want to create that feedback loop as an organization. We want to hear from you. We want to understand what's not clear so that ultimately we can address that and possibly improve the way that we communicate as well. So I think that's another key element of disarming, if you like, concerns around greenwashing and enabling you to communicate is by creating that feedback loop with your stakeholders.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. I think I'm going to ask two more questions, and then what I'm going to ask at the end is that both of you just give us a sort of, a little wrap up, or a sort of, the sort of people to take away from this. So I'll get you thinking about that while I ask this next question. But one that sparks, or a topic that sparks a lot of debate within the built environment, is offsetting. And I'm going to ask this question, but I know that you two aren't technical, but I want it comes away from a comms point of view rather than a sort of, a specification point of view. But Joe Perkins here has asked, many net zero plans rely on offsets or new builds, but obviously HVAC retrofits can deliver immediate CO2 cuts. When will a retrofit become standard? And shouldn't it be the baseline before offsets are even considered? I'd like to almost tweak that slightly and almost talk about how do we communicate offsets. Sorry. It sparks a lot of debate, and it is being used a lot in comms.
Yeah.
You
I might be slightly controversial around this because I just think that you shouldn't. Basically the regulations say that we should move away from it, and for good reason, because personally I think that they're confusing. Nobody quite understands how it works. They detract from actually potentially driving down emissions, which is I think what Joe is suggesting there. So instead of focusing on how you can offset things, focus on how you're going to drive down emissions and maybe invest that money internally instead, in terms of, how, can you use that money to speed that process up somehow? And certainly don't use it as a comms tool. I mean, I understand that there are things that we currently can't drive down emissions, but ultimately, I just think it's a complete distraction and just causes confusion. So it's just silly maths, I call it. Strange accounting.
I'm going to throw a slightly more pragmatic view into the mix, just acknowledging what Marlin's suggesting there. But again, I think this is where, to me, the impact of being clear about how offsetting fits into your overall carbon reduction planning, I think is crucial. So again, that where we can improve section of a green claims policy is a brilliant opportunity to discuss where we are right now, why we utilize offsetting in the way that we do, and ultimately what your plans are to reduce the burden, if you like, that's placed on offsetting, and your future plans for the company. So to me, again, we don't live in a perfect world. The offsetting space has a role to play currently. Perhaps it won't in the future. What are we doing in order to communicate clearly about the way that we're utilizing offsetting in our organizations and our plans for the future? That, I think, is how you facilitate utilizing some of the statistics associated with your offsetting operation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair point. I'm going to, a lot of the questions coming in are asking about various case studies. So I'm going to do one thing very quickly and plug Charlie's podcast, actually, the Responsible Edge. Amazing interviews with a lot of leaders in sustainability going through this challenge. Yeah, you can see that now on the screen. So do that. Charlie, when you're wrapping up, it'd be great to talk about that as well. The last question I'm going to ask, though, is that a lot of organizations are creating lists at the moment of what they're saying are green products. How do we see those lists working? Are they great competition? Is it collaboration? Same objectives, or buyers beware, I suppose? And it's a sort of, I think there's some great ones out there. I'll highlight a couple. The Journal of Biophilic Design has done one and created the Biophilic Design Sourcing Hub. ACAN have actually come out with, and especially their Netherlands side of thing, come out with a list of sort of, green materials. They're very transparent. But, how do we handle that? How do we sort of, look at those sort of lists? Charlie?
It's a really, really interesting question, Martin. I mean, I imagine not all lists of this nature are built the same. So obviously, I think the first thing that we do is we take that, that eye of curiosity, if you like, and understand the intention behind the list, like who's doing, who's behind this, why are they doing this? I think there's a lot of that kind of curious eye, if you like, skeptical eye, that's important in the modern media world, and therefore when we engage with lists like this. And then I think, this is where I think like the future of sustainability comms, if you like, there is this kind of community notes, if you like, element to this, and we need to come together collectively to essentially lift up and promote those lists, those sources, those frameworks, those voluntary initiatives that we think are doing the right things and having the right impact and can be understood and are credible. And that perhaps by doing that, we'll improve standards overall. So yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting one. I need to like inspect those individual lists myself to have a look at them and decide what's going on. But I think understanding who's behind them, I think, is crucial to understanding credibility.
Thank you, Charlie. Malin, we're going to come up now to sort of closing remarks, really. I think it's been a fascinating hour. Huge amount of questions, loads of chat going on. I really thank the audience for all the engagement. But Malin, just over to you for some closing thoughts.
Yeah, so I guess the thing that I would like you all to take away is thinking about essentially opening your knowledge, because I think that's the starting place. So starting place for all of this. So making sure that you understand it and not scared of this area, because getting the communications right and being transparent about where you are is so crucial for the success of the business, but also obviously this journey that we're on in general around sustainability. Because when we're quiet, I think a lot of people think that there's not a lot happening in this space at the moment, which is just not true. There's loads of progress still going on out there, but the fact that people aren't talking about it means that it gives that impression. So there's kind of two parts to that. So yeah, get the knowledge to get the courage to go out there, because that will help you stand out, and that's how you're going to get ahead in the space.
Brilliant. Charlie, just over to you.
Yeah, I want to make a couple of points, actually. I think the first one is just thank you so much to everyone who's turned up to today's webinar, and thank you to those, if any of you are on here, that have actually contributed to this survey. I think as Martin and Malin have both alluded to, this is a pulse survey. This is something that we're going to aim to do, for the next few years, if you like. And I think I'd really encourage you to, if possible, just have this marked as something that just becomes part of your annual, check-in on something that's really important to the industry. Because I think if we can track views and perspectives on communications, I think it will give us such insight that we can obviously then share with everyone that can ultimately help improve standards. So I don't want to underplay the impact of your guys' involvement in this pulse survey. And then I just want to leave on an aspirational thought of, if we can get this right. I actually mentioned this to Martin when we were at Futurebuild this year. If we can come up with sort of agreed standards of practice and ultimately levels of trust in what we're all communicating improve, and we're all able to take one another at perhaps a little bit more face value, if we achieve that outcome, it's actually going to have a significant impact. It'll allow us collectively to make decisions much faster, much more, essentially much quicker. And as a result of that, progress will be quickened up, and ultimately we'll be able to start addressing some of the fundamental issues at play in the sector and beyond. So I think when we often talk in this about it's terrible, there's this awful thing called greenwashing and now greenhushing, and it's bad, and these are the things that you need to do in order to address it. I think we need to actually start thinking about, well, if we do address it, what does the world look like for both the organizations that we run and the industry at large? And I think it's one where we will be able to counter some of these big issues at play collectively, and that's a goal worth striving for. So yeah, those would be my two reflections, Martin.
Amazing, thank you, and thank you both as well for your time today. I must say this has been a huge collaborative effort, and that's what we want. We want collaboration. Futurebuild is all about connecting people. So if you want to connect, find Charlie or Malin on LinkedIn. There's a links here. Reach out to them. You're going to be redirected in a minute to the report. Please use that. That's a great tool to share and collaborate across your teams as well. And if you want to get involved in Futurebuild, link in with me as well. We love just working with people that share this common goal of driving sustainability within the built environment. So thank you all for your time, and we'll see you at the next webinar.
Thank you.